Marty?
Glickman 1, camera roll 8, sound roll 5.
Okay, we'll wait until you're sitting down. Okay.
So Marty, the first thing I want to talk about is...
Watch the sound notes, please.
Okay, thank you. Is growing up, I know when I was a kid, and this is the 50s, not the Depression, but as a Jewish kid, there would often be signs painted on my sidewalk, things of that nature, anti-Semitic stuff. Can you remember any incidences from your childhood, mostly as a teenager, in the Depression, of those kinds of anti-Semitic?
No, I was brought up in an area which was a completely mixed neighborhood. We had Irish, Italians, and Jews.
Okay. Mark it, please.
Glickman 2, camera roll 8, sound roll 5.
Okay. Sit down and...
So to start with, if you can think of some of those experiences that you might have had.
I was not aware of anti-Semitism until I competed in high school sports. Playing football for James Madison High School in Brooklyn, for example, sometimes I would hear the phrase, "Get the Jew bastard," from some of the opposition. Now, there were Jews on my team and Jews on the opposition upon occasion as well, depended upon the team and the neighborhood from which they came. But that was my first feeling of resentment about being referred to as a Jew bastard in high school sports. Not regularly, rarely, but it did happen then. In collegiate sports, it became more apparent because I was away from the New York area, which was, well, had so many Jews as well as Italians and Irish at that time. Blacks came into the picture during the time I was in competition and after those years. But in college, I knew that, for example, I could not go into certain restaurants, certain areas where Jews were not welcome. There were towns in and around New York that were known to be anti-Semitic, where people could not live. You could not buy homes there. You could not rent apartments there. You couldn't go to certain clubs. I had some experience with the New York AC, where I was prevented from practicing at the New York Athletic Club after being invited to practice there by one of the trackmen at the New York AC. He said, "Marty, if you're training for the Sugar Bowl track meet," which I was, "come on down to the AC and work out with me." And so I went down to the AC, and I was refused permission to go to practice with my buddy who had invited me to practice there. This took place in the mid-30s.
How did they let you know? How did they, when you'd go to a or let's stick with the athletic club for a minute. How did they let you know that's, what did they tell you when you wanted to go in? What did they say to you?
I was invited to work out at the New York AC by this friend of mine. I went into the New York AC carrying my little satchel, having taken the subway in from Brooklyn, and was walking through the lobby of the AC when, let me start from the beginning again.
Do you want some water?
No, that's all
Okay,
right.
change the frame a little tighter.
I was invited to practice at the New York Athletic Club on 59th Street in Manhattan by a fellow who ran for the New York AC. I was then in training for the Sugar Bowl track meet. It was after my freshman year at Syracuse University, and I'd already been on the Olympic team. And so I took my little satchel in Brooklyn, took the subway into town, and went into the New York AC building. As I walked in, I encountered a gentleman named Paul Pilgrim, who is a director of athletics for the New York AC and a former great trackman. He says, "Marty, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm going to work out with Eddie O'Sullivan upstairs, who is a sprinter for the New York Athletic Club." He said, "Well, Marty, I'm afraid you can't go up there." I said, "Well, why not?" He says, "We have no room." I said, "Well, I don't need any room, really. I have my little satchel with my clothes in it. I'll use Eddie's locker." "I'm sorry, Marty, but you can't go up." And he refused to allow me to go up to the practice area for track. I turned left, got on the subway, and as I was riding back to Brooklyn, I realized for the first time that I couldn't practice at the New York AC because I'm Jewish. It just dawned upon me at that time. In those days, incidentally, the New York AC did not allow any Jewish members. I hasten to add that about a year ago, I was honored at the New York AC for my whatever achievements I have in broadcasting and in athletics.
When you say you weren't, there were certain restaurants you couldn't go into. How did they let you know that you couldn't go into a restaurant?
Small sign, restricted clientele. I was once in Marine Corps uniform shortly after I was in service.
Okay,
And
hang on a second, because no, don't cut. But that's a World War II story. That's a war story. We're going to stick with the Depression.
Okay.
So if you can tell me just an incident that you recall where you've gone to a restaurant and there was some sign or something to let you know you weren't allowed because you were Jewish.
Well, there were some restaurants and clubs in the New York area which had small signs as you entered, restricted clientele, and that was it. That informed you could not go there. I knew as a high school student that my chances of being admitted to certain schools, certain colleges, were extremely remote had I applied for admission to those schools. They not only refused admission to any Jew, but many schools had quotas as well, so that there were restrictions in that nature.
How did you know that they had quotas?
I was told they had quotas. I was told not to apply to certain schools.
By whom? Who would tell you this?
Well, grade advisors might tell me not to apply to this school or that school, and naturally I asked why. You see, I was an accomplished schoolboy athlete. I had opportunities to go to many colleges because I was the national schoolboy sprint champion. I was the most valuable football player in New York City in my senior year. Consequently, there were many schools who were looking to get an outstanding athlete. When I inquired as to certain schools that I might prefer, it was suggested to me by grade advisors, coaches, and friends not to try to apply there because they didn't accept Jews, or they were not partial to Jews.
Great. Okay, can we cut for a second, please?
Absolutely.
Glickman 3, camera roll 8, sound roll 5.
Hit it.
Well, we were talking over there before a little bit, and it was kind of it was intriguing for me that there's this dual thing as an athlete who has made it to the Olympics, but as a Jewish athlete who made it to the Olympics. Can you tell me what it meant to you to be able to compete in the Olympics, but that these Olympics were in Nazi Germany, and so you're not only allowed to compete, but you're also a Jew going to Nazi Germany?
I aspired to make the Olympic team for two reasons. One, because as an athlete, this is a goal for any track and field performer, to make the Olympic team and to participate in the Olympic Games and perhaps even to win a medal, perhaps even a gold medal. That was one reason I wanted to go, a purely selfish reason as an athlete. And the second reason, and I insist that it is the second reason, is because as a Jew, I could show the rest of the world that a Jew could be just as good and perhaps better than anyone else, or as anyone else, either way, as good as or better than. And certainly that myth of Nazi Aryan supremacy was exploded by the great black athletes who competed in the 1936 games in Nazi Germany. Certainly I knew that Germany was anti-Semitic. But when I went to Berlin in '36, my experience there was similar to my experience here in New York and in the States generally. I felt the same kind of anti-Semitism in '36 that I felt in New York, in America. There was anti-Semitism in the States, and there was anti-Semitism in Germany. Of course, this was 1936. This was 2 years before Kristallnacht. This was 3 years before the outbreak of war. In the context of '36, I felt the same feelings of anti-Semitism in New York as I felt in Berlin.
What did you see in Berlin that, what signs did you have of anti-Semitism in Berlin?
Actually, I saw no signs of anti-Semitism whatsoever. I felt the feeling of anti-Semitism because of some of the things I knew. There was a remarkable episode when I arrived, along with the rest of the team, at the Bahnhof in Berlin. We landed by ship in Hamburg and took the train into Berlin as a group. And a huge crowd was waiting for the arrival of the American team. There were newspapermen, there were newsreel cameramen, photographers all over the place. Hundreds of people seemed to have gathered there to greet the American team. As we were milling around on the platform of the station there, felt a tap on my shoulder, I turned, and there was this slight gentleman, maybe a couple of years older than me, who instantly I recognized as being American as soon as he opened his mouth, because he talked English in the American style. And he said to me, "Are you Marty Glickman?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." I was taken aback slightly. He said, "So am I." I said, "You're Jewish?" I said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "I'm going to med school." I said, "You're going to med school in Berlin?" He said, "Yes. I could not get into an American med school." We had a few words further, and then we departed. I haven't seen him since.
Great. Let's change it.
Let's cut.
Marky, please.
Glickman 4, change to camera roll 9, sound roll 5.
Okay, Marty, let's begin by talking about how you, when you got to Olympic Village and the kind of training that you did and your anticipation of running the race, and then what happened.
I was a member of the 400-meter relay team. We were composed of Frank Wyckoff, Sam Stoller, the other Jew on the team, Foy Draper, and myself. The four of us would practice passing the baton. We practiced for approximately 2 weeks in the Olympic Village before the event itself. We'd work out daily, and passing the baton on the 400-meter relay, as you might guess, is terribly important, and so we worked at it. During the course of that time, 2 days before the actual trials began in the games themselves for the 400-meter relay, we ran a trial heat to keep Stoller and Draper and myself sharp. We ran a full 100-meter race with all the accoutrements of a race, with the official starter and judges at the finish and timers and things like that. And it was just among the three of us. Stoller won that race. He won it by the width of his shoulder. I finished second, and Foy Draper finished third. The morning of the day we were supposed to run in the first trials in the 400-meter relay, the coaches called a meeting. They called a meeting amongst the 7 sprinters, head coach Lawson Robertson, who called the meeting, and the assistant head coach Dean Cromwell, who was also the head coach of track and field at Southern California. USC in those days was the dominant track power in collegiate track and field. They had 10 athletes from USC on the Olympic track team. And 2 of those athletes were Foy Draper and Frank Wyckoff on this 400-meter relay team. We were called into this meeting the morning of the day we were supposed to run the trials. And all 7 sprinters were called in: Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf and Mac Robinson, those 3 in addition to the 4 on the relay. And we were told by Lawson Robertson that there were very strong rumors that the Germans were hiding their best sprinters and saving them for the 400-meter relay to upset the American team. And consequently, Sam Stoller and I were going to be replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf. Well, Jesse and Ralph unquestionably were faster than Sam and me. They could beat us by a yard every time out. In the years I ran against Jesse, I never beat him. And he and Ralph could beat Sam and me every time out by a yard. But they had not touched a baton during the course of this time. And passing the baton in a relay, as I say, is terribly important. Naturally, Sam and I were terribly upset. Sam was shaken so badly, he vowed never to run again. But during the course of this meeting, being a brash 18-year-old, I said, "Coach, you can't hide world-class sprinters. You've got to run in world-class competition to become a world-class sprinter." And actually, the best German sprinter, Erich Borchmeyer, had finished 5th in the 100-meter final, beaten by Frank Wyckoff, who finished 4th. And Wyckoff, Stoller, and I could run 3 races and have 3 different winners. We all 3 could beat Borchmeyer. As a matter of fact, after the games, traveling through Europe, I beat Borchmeyer in Hamburg. So there was no question in any of our minds that we were better than any of the German sprinters. You just don't have sprinters who could be kept secret going into the Olympic Games. And this was the pretext to replace the two Jewish boys with the two great black athletes. The question has often been asked, wouldn't it be just as embarrassing for Hitler and company to have blacks run and win as Jews run and win? And the answer to that is that the black athletes were so dominant, had already won so many gold medals. They had won the 100, the 200, the 400, the 800, the high jump, and the long jump. They dominated those Berlin Olympic Games. And these were in the final days of the games themselves as far as track and field were concerned. Sam Stoller and I, were rather two obscure American sprinters, not nearly as well known as Jesse Owens, who the year before had set 3 world's records and tied a 4th in one afternoon in a Big Ten track meet at Ann Arbor, Michigan, when he ran for Ohio State. He was an internationally known star. So was Cornelius Johnson in the high jump. He'd set the world's record, tied with Dave Albritton. They finished 1-2 in the high jump. You couldn't keep these world record holders from competing, but you could keep 2 rather obscure athletes from competing, from standing on the winner's stand on the winning podium. There's no question that any of the sprinters in combination could have won that race handily. As a matter of actual fact, the race was won by the American team by 15 yards. Films taken by Leni Riefenstahl, that great German cinematographer, show the finish of that race with Frank Wyckoff crossing the finish line with no one else in sight. He was absolutely alone crossing the finish line.
Okay, hang on a second. Want to go back to the meeting? Okay, we'll do the analysis afterwards.
I was going to get back to it,
I just want to go back to the meeting and let's talk about what happened in the meeting,
okay.
What your reaction was, Sam's reaction, Jesse's reaction.
You want to start at the very beginning?
In the meeting itself.
Okay.
Just take me into the meeting itself.
During that meeting, when it was announced by Lawson Robertson that Sam and I would be replaced by Jesse and Ralph, Jesse, whom I admired enormously and who I got to love as a result of what took place in our friendship afterwards, Jesse said, "Coach, I've won my 3 gold medals. I'm tired. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it." And Lawson Robertson turned to Dean Cromwell, who pointed his finger at Jesse and said, "You'll do as you're told." And in those days, black athletes did as they were told. Jesse volunteered not to run so that Sam and I could run, but he was virtually forced to run. So the talk was of our not competing, very briefly. The talk was of the effect this announcement might have back in the States, and I suggested to them that there would be a furor about it, and indeed there was, but not a great furor. We were 2, as I say, relatively obscure athletes. There was no great hue and cry about the only 2 Jewish athletes on the team not being allowed to run. As a matter of actual fact, through the years, I've gone back since the beginning of the modern Olympic Games in 1896 in Athens, in Greece. And during the course of that time, no American track and field athlete physically able has ever not competed as a member of the Olympic team, except Sam Stoller and me in 1936.
Okay, let's cut for a second.
Okay.
Well, what do we do?
Glickman 5, camera roll 9, sound roll 5.
Just a second. Okay. Take a beat, take a breath, and just think about it.
A meeting was called the morning of the day we were supposed to run in the trial heats of the 400-meter relay. The men in the meeting were the 2 coaches, Lawson Robertson, the head coach, and Dean Cromwell, the assistant head track coach, and the 7 sprinters. And we were told by Lawson Robertson, the head coach, that there were strong rumors the Germans had been hiding their best sprinters and saving them to upset the American team. As a result, Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf would replace Sam Stoller and Marty Glickman. Naturally, Sam and I were shocked. This was totally unexpected. The 4 men on the relay team had practiced passing the baton throughout the practice period of 10 days to 2 weeks before the actual day of the event. Jesse said, "Coach, I don't want to run the relay. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it. I've won my 3 gold medals." Lawson Robertson turned to Dean Cromwell, and Cromwell said, pointing his finger at Jesse, "You'll do as you're told." And Jesse ran, even though he volunteered not to run. Sam was so shocked that afterwards he vowed never to compete again. He was a senior at Michigan. I was a freshman at Syracuse, and I was full of anger, frustration, and vowed to myself that in 4 years I'd win it all in 1940. I objected, saying that you can't hide world-class sprinters.
Okay, so let's stop for a second.
Okay, we'll have to change that.
Yeah, okay.
Can you mark it, please?
Glickman 6, change to camera roll 10, and sound roll 6.
Okay, now why, again, just try to picture, because I even get a picture of it, if you can just get a picture of where you were and what the room looked like and smelled like, and come back and then start, and you can start from the, the calling of the meeting and the going into the meeting.
The morning of the day we were scheduled to run in the trial heats of the 400-meter relay, we were called into a meeting, we being the 7 sprinters and 2 coaches, the head track coach, Lawson Robertson, and Dean Cromwell, the assistant head track coach. We were called into a day room at the end of one of the buildings in the Olympic Village in which we lived, and we sat around, the 9 of us, on beds and chairs and lounges. It was a brilliant, sunshiny morning. We were all nervous and tense, particularly me as an 18-year-old, knowing that I was going to run that day in the Olympic Games. And we sat there, and Lawson Robertson, the head coach, said that there were strong rumors that the Germans had been hiding, saving their best sprinters for the 400-meter relay to upset the American team, as we were heavily favored to win. And consequently, he was substituting Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf for Sam Stoller and me. And this was a shock, a whole flock of feelings, anger, frustration, resentment. Thought of anti-Semitism, obviously, because we were the only 2 Jews on that track team, Sam and I. And I said, "Coach, you can't hide world-class sprinters. You've got to be in world-class competition to become a world-class sprinter." He said, "Nevertheless," he said, "we're going to go ahead and make the change." And at that point, Jesse, whom I respected enormously and grew to love, said, "Coach, I've already won my 3 gold medals. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it." And Dean Cromwell pointed his finger at Jesse and said, "You'll do as you're told." And in those days, black athletes did as they were told. Sam was so upset, he didn't say a word during the course of the meeting. I, as a brash 18-year-old, suggested to the coaches that there might be a furor back in the States wherein the only 2 Jews on the track team were not going to compete in the Olympic Games. "We'll worry about that," said the coaches, "when the time comes." And the time was right then and there. And that was about it, because they ruled the roost. In those days, athletes listened to the coaches. They were the boss, particularly the head track coach and the assistant head track coach.
So when the event, what did you do when they finally ran the events? Where did you,
Well,
did you see the event? Did you?
Oh, sure. Following the meeting, Sam and I separately went to the Olympic Stadium by means of the conveyances they had between the village and the stadium, a distance of about 7 miles. And I sat in the stands and watched the 400-meter relay. And I saw the American team win that day in the trial heats and win handily. And the following day in the finals, and there could be no substitutions of the personnel on the team from the trial heats to the finals, I saw the American team win by 15 yards. When they finished the race, Frank Wyckoff, the anchorman, was all by himself. And the films by Leni Riefenstahl show that he was all alone at the finish line, 15 yards out in front. I sat in the stands, and as Ralph Metcalf ran the second leg down the backstretch, I felt myself saying, thinking, feeling, that should be me out there. That is me. Of course it wasn't, but it should have been me out there. And I saw him pass the opposition runners and hand the baton to Foy Draper, who ran the third leg, and then to Frank Wyckoff, who ran the anchor leg. Jesse had led off. And shortly after that, the 4 men were standing on the winning podium to receive the awards. And again, as they stood there, that should be me out there. They played the national anthem, the flags are raised, and we salute or put our hands over our hearts. And I kept looking out on this winning podium. The runners with the laurel wreaths around their heads, and looking at the flags rising at the other end of the stadium. And again, I'm here and I should be there. And that loss, that desolation, the fact that I was not there, and I should be. And this anger, as well as the frustration about the situation, my vow that 4 years from now, and I'd be all of 22 years of age, I'd win it all. I'd be that much stronger and faster and better, and I'd win the 100 and the 200 and run on the relay as well. That's what I felt.
Okay, when you were in the stands, did you see Hitler? Was he around? Were you anywhere? I mean, what was it like sitting in the stands at the Olympic Stadium, knowing that, you know, and you were on the field? I mean, you told us about how it felt to
Yeah.
watch the game, but
I sat in the stands every day of the track and field competition, and there was an area set aside for the Olympic athletes in which we sat. We were about, I would say, 50 feet removed from Adolf Hitler and his private box overlooking the stadium. And I could see him the way you might look across Fifth Avenue or across any fairly wide street of 50 feet or so. I could see him every day, and he was flanked on either side by his entourage of that fat Hermann Goering every day with those flashy uniforms and the big pig's jowled cheeks, and Joseph Goebbels, who was rat-like in countenance, and all the personnel of the entourage of Adolf Hitler. Hitler himself was very nervous watching the events. He'd sit there and move back and forth and rub his thighs with his hands as he watched some of the events.
So what did he do when Jesse Owens when the black athletes were just obliterating his supermen?
When the black athletes won their event, Hitler and his entourage would get up and leave the stadium. He was never present when the awards were presented to the winning black athletes. He was there quite frequently when other athletes, when the white athletes of the world received their acclamation and the laurel wreath and the Olympic medal was placed around their, on their chest and over their heads with the ribbon and all. But when the black athletes received their awards, he would leave. He would leave before they received their awards. We would watch him fairly regularly because he was a dominant figure. And as he'd come in every day, the stands would rise, 120,000 Germans, and shout, "Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!" And he'd answer with a Nazi salute, you know, and they'd, "Sieg Heil!" And I could look and see their faces and eyes of adoration of this man. He was a godlike figure to them. As for us, for the Americans, I'll never forget walking into the stadium in the opening day ceremonies as the Americans paraded in, and I use the word parade loosely because American athletes don't march very well. They kind of slouch along. And we walked in, we hadn't seen Hitler before, and as we walked before the reviewing stand, Hitler's standing up there and glowering down at us. We looked up at him, and he down at us, and you could hear the comment run through our ranks. And I said it as well, "He looks just like Charlie Chaplin." Now, we had no idea what this monster was going to be. This was 1936, and 2 years before Kristallnacht, and 3 years before the outbreak of war.
Hey, when you mentioned Kristallnacht, what was your reaction to Kristallnacht when you finally heard in '38 that this place you had been that didn't seem so bad to you, all of a sudden had erupted the way it had? What was your sense about it?
When I read about Kristallnacht, it was with a feeling of disbelief. These were the German people whom I had seen and who were wonderfully friendly. All you had to do was wear an Olympic uniform, and of course we wore those American straw hats and blue blazers, which identified us as members of the American Olympic team, and we were welcome and fawned upon wherever we went. They couldn't recognize me as a Jew or a Gentile. You could recognize the black, certainly. And along that line, Jesse Owens was revered by the population of Berlin. Wherever he went.
Mark it, please.
Glickman 7, change to camera 11, sound roll 6.
Okay, let's talk about the German people and Jesse Owens.
The German people adored Jesse Owens. When he'd make his appearance on the track, the huge crowd would together roar his name, Owens, Owens, Owens. The W in German sounding as a V, Owens, Owens, Owens. They were chanting in unison. The sound reverberated throughout the stadium. He was so popular, he had to use a secret entranceway and exit to go into the stadium and out of the stadium, else he would have been mobbed by the adoring populace. He was just the most popular man, in addition to Adolf Hitler, in Berlin in those days. Jesse was wonderful, and we developed a close friendship which ran through all the years he lived. He died in 1980. The fact is, I'm often asked why it was all right for blacks to replace Jews and stand on the winning podium in the 400-meter relay championship. Blacks were dominant in those games. They won the 100, the 200, the 400, the 800, the high jump, the long jump. They placed well up in other events as well, the hurdles, the distance races. We were the only two Jews on the team. And I believe that the anti-Semitism shown Sam Stoller and me came from American Nazis and not the German Nazis. Avery Brundage later became a founder, an officer, an organizer of the America First Committee.
Okay, hang on a second. But I'm telling you, it won't make it. So really the way you have to...
Right.
Well, he was an American Nazi. He was an America Firster. The
Well,
American,
you can say that. You can say if you joined the American...
Marketplace.
Glickman 8, camera 11, sound roll 6.
Okay.
Let me just pick it up from there in terms of the...
America's great black athletes were smashing this myth of Nazi Aryan supremacy to smithereens with all their victories. The black race, obviously non-Aryan, was winning most of the track and field competitions. 100, 200, 400, 800, the high jump, the long jump, placing very high up in the other events as well. And it was terribly embarrassing to the Nazis there, the German Nazis. So much so that it's my belief that American sympathizers, members of the America First Committee, it later turned out, Avery Brundage, for example, the president of the American Olympic Committee, was a founder and organizer of the America First Committee. And the America First Committee, in case you haven't heard, was that group in America which was sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Well, Avery Brundage and Dean Cromwell, the assistant head track coach, were members of the America First Committee, as it proved to be later on. And they had their sympathies with the German Nazis. And they wished not to further embarrass the German authorities, the Nazis, by having Jews stand on the winning podium, as we were inevitably to do had we been allowed to compete in the 400-meter relay. We were a yard less speedy than Ralph Metcalfe and Jesse Owens. But we've been practicing passing the baton for weeks before the event itself. And even Frank Wyckoff said later that the time for the American winning effort would have probably have been faster had Sam and I run, because our baton passing would have been superior. It so happened that the baton passing by the American team was not particularly good. So in order to save the Nazis the further embarrassment of having Jews stand on the winning podium, which indeed we would have, we were replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe.
What do you say to people who would say, well, but isn't it a coach's responsibility to field the fastest team he can, to win?
The coaches, of course, have the responsibility of fielding the fastest team. As a team, the four white men in this situation who practiced passing the baton could have been the faster team because of the superior baton passing. But winning is not the key to the Olympic Games. The important element of the Olympic Games is taking part in participating. Actually, the 1,600-meter relay team, the 4x400-meter relay team, might have been replaced by two great black athletes who finished first and third in the 400-meter run. But they were not part of the composition of the American team, who subsequently lost in the 1,600-meter relay team to Great Britain, who finished first, the American team being beaten by a foot. Archie Williams finished first in the 400-meter run, a great black athlete from California. Jimmy Lou Valley finished third in the 400-meter run, a great black athlete from UCLA. Finishing second and fourth were two British athletes, so there was an obvious threat from Great Britain to win the 1,600-meter relay. But there were no substitutions of Williams and Lou Valley on the 1,600-meter relay team. Four white Americans, non-Jews, ran in that 1,600-meter relay team, and they were beaten. There might have been reason to replace those men on the 1,600-meter relay team because of the threat of the British, but no such change was made. And I'm happy that the four men who represented America and finished second in that race did get to run. That's the whole point of the Games. Winning is not the overall emphasis on the Games, even though we make it so nowadays. Taking part, participating, being there is the key. There were hundreds of other athletes from all over the world who never had a chance.
Okay, now can you just say, keep the same focal length. Can you just, hang on a second, and can you just say now, tell me that as far as you know, You're the only two men who have ever been taken to competition.
Eh,
I'm sorry.
Change it.
the phone.
Okay, closer. Got it.
As far as I know, and I've checked back through the beginning of the modern Olympic Games from 1896 to the present day, no healthy, physically fit American track and field athlete has ever not competed in the Olympic Games, except Sam Stoller and me, the two Jews on the 1936 team.
Great. Okay. Now I want to. Can we cut for a
That's
second?
sure.
Because I want to move on to.
Marky, please.
Glickman 9, camera roll 11, sound roll 6.
So can you tell me what you remember of Joe Louis, and did you listen to any of Joe Louis's fights?
I was an undergraduate at Syracuse University when Joe Louis came to prominence in the mid-30s. And I was terribly disappointed in June of 1936 when Schmeling defeated Joe Louis and knocked him out, as I recall, something around the 11th or 12th round. I don't remember exactly. And then Louis went on to win the championship the following year, the heavyweight championship of the world from Jim Braddock in 37. Then in 38, he fought Schmeling again. And I felt enormous satisfaction when listening to the fight. Schmeling was KO'd in the first round and hit so hard that he actually screamed in pain when Joe Louis knocked him out in the first round.
Why did you feel such satisfaction? What was it that was so satisfying about it?
Max Schmeling was the embodiment of the German athlete. He claimed not to be a Nazi, Max did, but he did represent Germany. And Joe Louis represented the minority races of the world, the minority race of America, certainly. And being as close to Jesse Owens and the other great black athletes and competing with and against them for so many years, I felt I was on Joe Louis's side against these Nazis who by this time had done so many things to incur the hate of people all over the world. And so Joe Louis representing America and American blacks against Max Schmeling representing Hitler and Nazism, it was a natural feeling of joy, of great satisfaction that this non-Aryan cut him to pieces.
Great. Okay, you can cut.
Okay.
Before we
We have like 20
Come here, come on.
Okay.
go ahead, you got it.
The 36 years were still Depression years. When I went to the Olympic Games in Berlin, my family scraped together $30 to give me as spending money for the 1 month I would be gone. That's all they had. And so with $30, I went to Europe and spent those 4 weeks. That's how tough it was in those days.
Can you sing the song?
Go ahead, keep singing.
Once I built a railroad.
Let's roll out.
Yeah,
You're lucky.
Too bad.
Is that meaningful?